presenting the next speaker, Brenda Loya. The stage is yours.
Thank you. All right. So my name is Brenda. I am the CEO and one of the co-founders of Teller. And today I'm not going to be really talking about Teller. I'm going to be talking about how we need to expand we need to go from just using crypto as to remove intermediaries, to expand our horizon, to basically start doing things that we can do better from the traditional system that does not just involve making money. And this talk, it specifically talks about the CPI. I think it's one of the most important economic measures that affect everybody broadly. This quote is by Ben Franklin. He was one of the founding fathers of the US, and initially he says taxes, right? We cannot avoid taxes. But as you all know, if you have enough money, especially in the US, you probably can. But inflation, it doesn't matter if you're rich, if you're poor, wherever you are, you face inflation. And inflation is basically just measures the change of the average cost to buy a basket of goods and services over time. So that's all that it does. It's a very simple measure, but it's used really broadly by governments to do all sorts of things that directly have an effect on you. They adjust government assistance programs, like in the US, for example, we have these food stamps, we have payments to retirees. It also used to evaluate whether or not you qualify for this type of help, and as well as cost of living adjustments. So in general, if you work in a city like New York, you're probably going to earn a higher wage than if you do the same job in El Paso, Texas, where the cost of living is much lower. And that cost of living adjustment is generally based on inflation and just how much it costs to live in the city. And also, if you're in a traditional, or even if you work for the government, mostly I don't see this as much on crypto, but your wages on a yearly basis are generally adjusted by this inflation measure, just to keep you basically being able to afford what you are able to afford right now, so you can afford it next year. And then obviously monetary policy. The US uses this inflation measure to directly impact the money supply in circulation. The money supply in circulation, it's really important because it's basically a way for the government to, and I was talking to somebody earlier, and I think it was pretty innovative, so I'm stealing it, to basically devalue your money or take money away from you on a yearly basis. So if inflation increases by 2% each year your purchasing power decreases by that much. And that's just accepted, right? So this is a measure that comes out every month that not a lot of people realize how directly it affects their pockets and how important it is to them. With that in mind, let me tell you a little bit of how the CPI started. The CPI started because Republicans and Democrats wanted to know who was right about implementing the Tariff Act of 1890. Basically, they increased these tariffs really high, and it was like 50%, like something, we had a surplus, and they wanted to basically decrease the amount of imports that we were getting. So they implemented this, and then they were like, let's see who's right and who's wrong, and use this next time when we run for, Congress or whatever. And that's how it started, super politicized. And then it didn't take, and then the very first survey only included white guys, married guys that lived in the city. That's it. That was the extent of the survey. That's who they wanted to know, how they got impacted, and that was how they were going to drive their policies. And it took 50 years for them to actually start including other groups, like Hispanics and Blacks in the US. So 50 years of this inflation measure and doing policies based on this that completely excluded full portions of the population And then it took after that, they included them, but they also included them very purposefully underrepresented. And it took another 40 years for them to actually go back and do a revamp of the survey, where instead of just collecting specific items in a basket, or bread, egg, butter, whatever, now they changed it to actually do categories. So they broadened the survey. They sort of try to tackle a little bit of the bias that was already there, but it's still an imperfect measure. To change methodology for the CPI, it's almost like trying to move a mountain. It's very difficult because it can be very politicized. And a lot of research goes into that. The CPI has a lot of criticisms, starting from substitution bias, lagged inclusion of new items, poorly measures, changes in quality. These are all things that we have known from the beginning of the survey. There's a lot of people that focus on this, and I want to tell you that substitution bias is just because I saw a post on Twitter 3 days ago talking about how the price of meat went up from $10 to $20, but yet the government is assuming that instead of eating meat, you're just going to eat some burger that only went up 10 cents. And so they were disagreeing with the CPI because they were like, it's under measuring, and I'm not just as well off before because I wanted steak, and it's way more expensive, but I don't want to substitute it for a burger. And that's basically what substitution bias is. It's like basically it's assumed that you are still keeping your standard of living. You just shift from eating pasta to eating more rice or whatever else it is that you eat more often because it's cheaper. And so you're still at the same standard of living, but you substitute. So that's what that means. For new items, basically the basket of goods or the things that are tracked over time by the government, it's identified at the beginning of the survey, and then it's tracked over time. So over time, obviously, some of those things become obsolete. So maybe they were tracking like iPhones 14s, and now we're on 15 or 16, whatever number they are now. They're not equally, and they're not included, right? They're different things. They're not included, or maybe we all start using some other platform to do something innovative, and that's not going to be included because it hasn't been there for it to be tracked. And quality changes is basically, going back to the iPhone, like if you're trying to track prices for the iPhone 14 and now it's the 15, you have to make an adjustment for maybe the camera is better, so it doesn't show up as just inflation. But the elephant in the room, I think, it's basically the conflict of interest of what the government is providing as a measure of inflation and how they actually use it. So the government actually gives their employees an adjustment each year based on the inflation measure. So if I'm going to give everybody an increase and I am reporting a 3% CPI, then inflation index, then everybody gets a 3% increase. But if I end up calculating a 20% one, then everybody gets a 20%. So there is a conflict of interest there, right? Not just there, but also in their political agendas, depending on what's happening in the country. And I think in the US, I think they're doing okay. I mean, we try our best. We try our best. But like, there are some examples that are really interesting to me, like the one in Argentina. Argentina has not been underwater. They have resources, they have ports, and yet from 2007 to 2015, the government openly admitted to just cooking the inflation numbers. They just made them up, basically, sort of. And so they did this because obviously they had political agendas. They wanted some loans from the World Bank, and so if your inflation is really high, then your money is not worth that much, and it might be more difficult for you to be able to pay your debts. So you want to make sure that you have a lower inflation rate, and that's what they did. They, instead of reporting the whole inflation rate, they reported about a third of it. So Venezuela, I don't even know what's going on there, but it's also one of those cases where if you cannot trust your government because they're corrupt, how can you trust the statistics that they're providing you? Zimbabwe is another example where I think what they did is they decided to use old methodology because for an implementation of one of their policies because they didn't like the new one. And that's just, what the government decided to do. So these are just a few examples of what's going on in the world right now. I think Argentina right now is doing a little better. Their inflation rate is being reported more accurately right now, but they're like at 300% or something crazy like that. They'll eventually, I think, come down to a normal CPI with their new policies, hopefully. But in general, we have to think about this. Government statistics are basically provided just by the government, and we just assume, or we are required, I guess, to just trust them, right? They are obviously looking out for us. But in the US, we have antitrust laws because we want to protect our consumers. When there's no competition, when there is no oversight, there is no reason for the company to want to do better, to want to improve their products. And so if the government has no oversight, has really, and it's the end-all, be-all of these statistics, and these are the official statistics that are used by all of these legislators, what is their drive to make it better, right? And so I don't think there is one. But now we have technology that can allow us to actually create something that is independent and provides this oversight. So what I'm proposing is basically a structure where if you want to do any type of research, you publicize it on IPFS or something like that, that it's a decentralized storage platform. And then obviously you do have to find incentives to start that development. But once you do, all the raw data needs to be also saved on a DSP or IPFS or something similar. The reasoning behind that is because right now we have the methodology available for what the government says they are doing with the data. However, we don't have the underlying data to actually go and research it and make sure that they apply the methodology the way that they say that they applied it. So the next step is also publish your methodology where anybody and everybody can find it and apply it and make sure that you're doing what you say you're doing. And then publish the outcome of your research also on chain. And then what this creates is an open peer review. Everything is out there, and if you don't agree with my methodology or whoever else's methodology, go look at the raw data, make it better, publish your own methodology, and do it again. Like that you don't have to redo the whole cycle. But if you do think that in general, like the actual survey was flawed, there's a whole a whole class, studies that go into just how you word questions so that you don't bias people's answers. So if you think that it was flawed, then redo it again and start over. But then once you make it transparent, you allow everybody to make sure or to do that peer review for you. For the CPI, what I'm proposing is using methodology that has already been used in the past. Alberto Cavallo and Manuel Bertolotto, I believe they're Argentinian, but they started this project called a Billion Prices Project in MIT. And they went back to Argentina and tried to recreate their CPI numbers from 2007 to 2015 because there was that gap when it was basically made up. So they went back and recreated it using scraped data. They went back, they did all the research, they were able to, this is before 2020. So back then, so when they did this in 2017, when they recreated the data, they were able to see that the majority of the prices online were fairly correlated with the prices offline. So they went back, they recreated the whole period, and what they ended up coming back with is, after they went through everything, was that basically the way that the numbers were being manipulated were not at the microdata level. Microdata is like the actual pricing information. It's very difficult to get a whole room of people to agree on politics, yet alone like try and figure out what outliers to include or not include, especially if they're not in the same party or whatever, different ideologies. But what they were doing, or what they think they were doing based on what they came up with, is they were basically they had the correct trend, they were just dividing it by a third. So everything was being processed, fairly correct, and then what was actually publicized for the people was just divided by a third and call it a day. And that's and anyway, with that in mind, using their methodology, I think it should be more than good enough now that after the pandemic, a lot of off-chain prices, have gone online. At least in the U.S., the majority of our shopping, I think, people just moved or changed their behavior. So instead of shopping on actual stores, we do a lot of shopping online, and so that provides a wealth of information and data that we can use now that it's going to be, in my even more correlated than, that's a theory because I haven't seen the data, but if they were able to observe that before 2020, I think we should be able to observe similar trend now. The biggest thing for any type of survey data, it's outlier detection. And the government and our taxes, what they basically pay for is for them to have all of these people looking at this data and cleaning it up and classifying it, and then just processing it through an aggregation, an aggregation software, so that we can all see an index. So the majority of the money goes in outlier detection and classification. So if we can automate those to be more efficient, we can do this way cheaper and produce something of fairly good quality to be able to provide this measure that should be complementary to what the government is creating, right? If they have nothing to hide, if they're doing everything the best that they can do with the information that they have, then it should be very, very similar. The problem arises when it actually starts challenging the government statistics. So with that in mind, that's one of the reasons that everything should be saved on a DSP or an IPFS or something like that. And you have to use an oracle that is censorship resistant, right? We want to make sure that even if the government says shut down, that the protocol still works. And that's why I'm going to be using Teller, obviously. Censorship resistance, there's no fee for new data feeds. So that's really important because this is a common good. And eventually, it should be owned by the community, so anybody should be able to tip it and be able to create and incentivize a CPI for a specific geographic area. Anybody can dispute it, anybody can stake. So Teller is going to have its own layer 1, so it's going to make it really easy to just bridge the data over. And then once you have this economic measure on chain that is openly available to everybody and it becomes robust enough, then you can actually use it to create stable coins and create other things on top of it. And that is completely independent from the government, especially in areas where you can't really trust the government. So the way that it works is very simple. It's really 3 contracts. One contract where you register your research, your methodology, and the outcome. And then another contract where it's going to be different contracts for each type of research that you're doing. And you just collect the data and you track the reputation of the people, of the data scrapers mostly. And then Teller is just an oracle. It could be another oracle too. I'm focusing on them because Teller is censorship resistant, and I think that's necessary in this case. So they would be just used to aggregate data, which is aggregate the data and just report back the CPI on chain, and then track the provider reputation, which is just basically something that we would define how to do, and then they just aggregate the information and provide it. We have currently everything that we need to be able to create this, and that's what I'll be working on now. Like I said, I do run Teller, but I think that we have been focused for far too long on just bringing off-chain data on-chain. We can actually do some of these, we can create better data using our systems and not depending on archaic architectures that were just there, because really that was the best thing that we could do at that moment in time. So, and obviously we don't want to be hunted by people's political agendas. I know this is a public good and it might seem like it's sort of a dream, but if you think about it, the US government, at least for now, they collect about 80,000 prices of different items each month, and they collect this for free. Nobody pays for that data. And in 1942, I'm trying to see, am I still good? Yes, with time. Okay, so in 1942, the US government implemented price controls for different types of food, like meat, bread. The war was going on. And what they did, they actually took a bunch of mostly housewives, because they usually were the ones going out and shopping for groceries, and they trained them. They would give them each week a set of prices for each item, and they were actually the enforcers. They did this for free. So people can do a lot of things for free for the government already. And they did that. I mean, they no longer have this in the US, but they were able to implement this policy, this US policy-wide thing with just volunteers on, on food. Obviously, there's a benefit to them because they, if a store was increasing the price over what was the control price that was provided for them, they had to pay less, right? So they were incentivized because they knew, like, hey, this is not the price, you have to bring it down. And then they went back and reported them to the government. So these can absolutely be done. It has to be community funded, and it has to be community driven, and it has to be geographically focused, because it has to be the community that wants to drive this and push this forward. What I'm going to do and what I'm trying to build right now is building the very first one, and I think this one of the safest places, and also because I live there, I feel like the US is fine, it's like it's where I know, it's what I know, and I think there shouldn't be too much of resistance, even if it comes out, hopefully, because I do think that they are doing the best thing that they can do with the data that they have. So that is what I am building right now, but I'm happy to answer any questions in terms of methodology or like random, sorry. Yeah.
Thanks. I wanted to ask, so you want to work on that in US, right? Why did you decide to have a speech in Prague?
So what?
Why did you decide to have the speech in Prague, in Czech Republic?
So this is going to be community driven. It's going to start in the US because it's easy for me. That's where I live. I live
yes,
it.
but...
Yeah. I think that the majority of the benefits for something like this are going to be in, I don't know if it would be in Prague, but definitely Latin America. And I thought that this would be a great place to talk about it. I don't know if how much people trust or don't trust their governments in this side of the world, but basically it wasn't really like, I'm going to go to Prague and present this. I came to DAPCon and presented this. I'm going to be here. I'll be in Belgrade. I do want to make my way back to Latin America. I know that that's, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the thing. It keeps moving. That's where it has been needed in the past. But the 3 examples that I provided, I mean, Zimbabwe was somebody else mentioned it to me, and I was like, it's not just and I'm sure there's plenty of people in the US that also don't trust the government and don't trust that the CPI is correct. But like, if you really disagree, then join, and let's try and build this, and let's provide some oversight. But yeah, I didn't specifically say like Prague. I didn't think Prague people don't trust their governments. So.
Yeah, you just mentioned that this should be area specific and it should be community driven. And is it more like you're seeking for some community here, or just sharing it across the world and checking if this problem exists also in different countries, if people think about that?
Yeah, I would like to know, because it's easier to create an index for an area, right? Because you can collect more information. So you cannot create an index from like 3 prices. You have to have community or data scraping, depending on how you're going to build it. So the two things that I want to do is the CPI, which would be doing data scraping with a bunch of data. So that would be like, but then the Big Mac index, which is something else that already exists, and it's mostly collected just from different McDonald's around the world. Like you want to make sure that you collect all the McDonald's in one area, all the McDonald's in another area, to be able to create that type of index.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That's it. Thank you.
So if you guys don't trust your governments, just call me. Sorry.
Is there any other questions?
Thank you very much. I guess that, for example, in Prague, we kind of trust the government statistics, but because we have no other choice, like this is the change of the paradigm, right? My question to you is, you mentioned that people might be doing this stuff for free because they did it in the past, and also the teller has no fee, and I'm wondering, this does not seem to be sustainable.
So Teller has no fee for new price feeds. You do eventually you do have to tip or incentivize reporters to go get the data. But there are some oracles that will charge you thousands and thousands of dollars just to support one new feed, and Teller doesn't, as long as you provide the definition.
So there is some economic model.
Yeah, so eventually that's why it's a public good. So just like we use taxes to pay for the government to have all of these people doing classification and outlier, cleaning up the data, we have to have something similar, but it can go, the way that I envision it is going to be a DAO, and then you just tip Teller directly. So that way, if we go away and that has already been specified and the infrastructure is there, it can continue to survive without me.
Sure, yeah, that makes sense, thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Any other questions?
Hello. I wanted to ask, the consumer price index is dependent on the prices, which can be scraped, and you have the data, but it is also dependent on how you set up the basket of the goods. And I think this choice is always arbitrary, so how it should be done in this case?
Yeah, so you have to look at the data. It's going to be very similar to the category. It's going to follow the same categories that the U.S. has, the same big categories, and just, yeah, I mean, it's not just that, it's also the weights of the categories. So initially, because we don't have data already out there aside from what the government is providing, it would have to lean on that. So you would get the weights for those categories, and then as you scrape the data and you classify them into those categories, that's how they would be weighted. At least, when you get started. Once you have enough data and you can actually come up with better or more independent weights on how people are using this, then we can shift away from what they provide, right? But I think initially, especially based on their research, that's what they did, and it worked okay. It doesn't mean that we wouldn't eventually move to a more decentralized and more independent way of doing it. But yes, that's always hard. I mean, how you ask the questions, what kind of items you include, that's always, or you can collect, right? Because we're data scraping, so whatever we can get our hands in is going to be as long as it falls in that category and there's a previous price for it, then we can actually use it.
And for example, if you choose some basket, and I would disagree with that, and I will start the dispute, how this will be resolved?
You can do your own methodology, right? So if the raw data, that's why the underlying data is going to be on a DSP. So if you don't agree with the way that I classified each of the things, then you can do it your own way. The reason it's not exactly a basket of goods anymore, that it's just like bread, eggs, and potatoes, is because you have, for example, I'm Mexican, we eat a lot of corn, right? So in the US, if you're just measuring bread and potatoes and eggs, you're not capturing my inflation rate, which I guarantee you, I'm going to buy tortillas this, Friday. So that's why now it's more of a basket. It's a classification of goods. So as long as it's food, it's thrown into the food classification, and that's how it's tracked. Sorry.
Anyways, that's all the time we have.
Thank you so much.
Brenda, for giving that great presentation, and I hope you have a great time at ETH Prague.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for emceeing for me.